Today we're reviewing Fractal's Meshify 2 XL. We already reviewed the Meshify 2, but not the XL version. The other large cases we've looked at lately would include the Phanteks Enthoo Pro 2. A little bit ago we looked at the Lian Li O11 XL, and that's most of them. The P500A is a little on the larger side, but in terms of cases that are targeting the so-called E-ATX market, or the SSI-EEB market as it's more appropriately named, there aren't that many out there, and we've seen a lot of interest in them. That's why we're bringing back the Meshify 2 XL for review. We actually started testing this one before the Meshify 2 non-XL review went up, which tells you how busy the last few months have been. But we're here now with it, and it is essentially to the Meshify 2 non-XL what the Define 7 is to the Define 7 XL, which is a larger version of the same case. Before that, this video is brought to you by EK Water Blocks and its RTX 30 series Vector Water Blocks. The EK Quantum Vector blocks include options for Founders Edition 3080 and 3090 cooling, Asus TUF and Strix 3080 blocks, EVGA XC3 and FTW3 blocks, and more. EK has blackout, acrylic, and RGB blocks available, including new special edition blocks with minimalistic aesthetics. Learn more at the link in the description below. So the build section for this review is going to be shorter this time than the Meshify 2. It's basically the same case. It's a stretched, larger version of it. If you want the full details on the build section, which is where we talk about and classify the quality of life features, so ease of installation, cable management, general fitness and form and function, everything short of thermals and noise, we classify in the build section. So if you're really looking at this and you need more info on the internals, check out the Meshify 2 non-XL review. You don't have to watch the whole thing, but just the build section will be most interesting to you, and then you can come back to this for the thermals and noise. So we're gonna keep that a bit short to prevent repeating ourselves too much, but the basics are in there. For this one, it is larger. It's still got the door that pulls out from the logo, so you can see that right there. But door pulls open. There is a mesh filter. We test with and without the dust filter for this, in addition to the mesh front panel. So you've got a double filter there. Sometimes it works well, sometimes it doesn't. You'll see in the thermal section though how it does. The rest of the case is fairly familiar, so they still, as a recap, got rid of the push button that was on the back of some of the other cases in the Define series that we thought was just pointless. It was interesting from a mechanics perspective, but unfortunately didn't work too well. Under the weight of the panel, it would often just kind of fizzle and do nothing when you push the button to pop the panel up. So they did get rid of that, but that was gotten rid of. We talked about that in the previous one as well. There's a couple screws up there if you do want to loosen some of the trays and get access to things. Otherwise, just a stretched version of the Meshify 2. 2 fans in the front, 1 in the rear, and room for more if you wanted to add them. Okay, so enough about that. Let's get into Patrick's build section, then we'll talk thermals and noise and go over the conclusion. Hard drive cages must be removed through the top of the power supply shroud and will not fit through the side of the case. This was true of the non-XL Meshify 2 as well, but we mention it here because the XL includes 2 cages rather than 1, creating a traffic jam underneath the shroud. We chose to remove the cage closest to the power supply to give ourselves extra cable management room, but this requires removing the front hard drive cage first to get it out of the way. This is in addition to the fact that the cages are screwed in from the bottom of the case, requiring flipping the whole system over and taking the bottom filter off in order to remove them. Fractal has chosen this approach over a single thumb screw method in order to allow the cages to be repositioned. So there is a valid reason for it, but that doesn't make it less annoying to deal with. Hard drive support is a major feature of Fractal's larger cases. The XL lists support for a maximum of 18 drives, with 6 trays and 2 multi-brackets included. The trays used inside the hard drive cages are the same trays that can be mounted inside the body of the case in storage layout, and these can be purchased separately. As with many of Fractal's other cases, including the Meshify 2, the XL can be converted to storage layout by moving part of the motherboard tray and dedicating the front section of the case to horizontal drive mounts. What makes this special in the XL is that this doesn't sacrifice any motherboard standoffs. Full SSI-EEB server form factor motherboards can still be installed, making this an interesting platform for a home server. As we mentioned in the Meshify 2 review, the upper filter of the XL has numerous reinforcing ribs that support the metal mesh of the top panel. It's hard to say how much this helps, but the ribs do make good contact with the mesh, and the top panel keeps its shape well under light pressure. It also does that without the filter, so we'd still recommend removing it in top exhaust configurations. Speaking of the rigidity of the top panel, we've noticed some slight folding at the rear corners, as if punching out the hole to fit the mesh rectangle warped the panel. And in talking about the filters, it became increasingly annoying over the course of working with the case to be forced to take the door off of the case in order to remove the front filter. It's so close to being able to slide out that that's probably what makes it frustrating to work with. It's not hard to remove the door, and you probably aren't doing that too often, but it doesn't need to be necessary. It's very close to working anyway. Large form factor boards are relatively rare these days, so the mainstream appeal of an XL case is as a platform for liquid cooling, or for one of those few larger form factor boards. To that end, the Meshify 2 XL supports up to a 480 radiator in the front and the top mounts, 120 at the rear, and 280 at the bottom. Fractal hasn't gone completely overboard with its claims here either, as evidenced by the rear mount. A 140 CLC could potentially be squeezed in, but most won't fit. So they've rightfully chosen not to list support because you do have to combat the tank size in addition to the actual fan size. Likewise, the front and top mounts do indeed both support 480mm radiators, but not at the same time. Of these, the top mount is easier to work with and requires less reconfiguration of the power supply shroud and the hard drive mounts. Full-length radiators must be installed with barbs at the rear of the case to line up with the top mount. Multiple radiator configurations would restrict maximum motherboard component height to 36mm, especially 140mm wide rads. So full details are available in the manual for this, and we'd encourage you to check them out if you're planning a complex water-cooled build. The 280mm bottom mount is nice as an option, and Fractal deserves credit for sticking fan mounts on every unused inch of the case, but any one of the other mounts is preferable here. The power supply shroud isn't removable, so any bottom-mounted fans or radiators will be nested in a pile of metal and cables with limited tube routing options. The bottom of the case also only has 2.3 centimeters of clearance, which would restrict any bottom intake setups. Fractal sent us a Flex B20 vertical GPU mounting kit along with their Meshify cases. This kit doesn't come standard with either case, both of which have their own built-in vertical slots. We prefer conversion kits to built-in slots because built-in slots are inevitably jammed against the side panel of the case, which makes them useless for air-cooled GPUs that tend to overheat in that configuration and start downclocking. Converting the horizontal PCIe expansion slots allows the GPU to be mounted much further from the side panel, potentially giving it even better cooling than a traditional mount, although complications with CPU and chipset cooling may arise and how they all fit together. The B20 kit takes up 7 slots, which gives it 2 slots of play to move up or down in the 9-slot XL. That means there's ample room to vertically mount even the extra wide card that we use for case testing, which typically would conflict with our tower cooler. The downside of this adjustability is that there are no anchor points on the surface of the GPU shroud, so the mount isn't as stable as it could be. Extra long fan cables are a nice consideration for a case this large, especially one with a built-in fan hub. We never use built-in fan hubs, so we can appreciate giving enough slack to allow users to plug fans in elsewhere. Taking a rough measurement of one of the front fan cables from the point that it emerges from the front panel came out to more than 38 inches, almost a full meter, and more than enough to reach any location in the case. That said, we'd like to see more options for routing fan cables from the front of the case. There's only one tiny cutout for the front fan cables, which is inadequate in a case that can support 4 120mm front fans. Converting to storage layout or routing cables above or below the motherboard tray would give more options, but there should still be 1 or 2 more cutouts. Time to get into the thermal and noise testing. The Meshify 2 XL is obviously larger than the Meshify 2, but the fan layout and front panel design are the same, so thermal behavior should be in some ways similar. With that in mind, we focused on doing tests that we didn't have much time to do in the original Meshify 2 review. For example, we didn't see much difference from removing the front filter when using stock fans originally. So we performed a test in the XL with the filter removed, but also with the standardized set of Noctua fans that we use for additional testing installed. As mentioned earlier, we also tested the add-in B20 vertical GPU kit, which is not to be confused in these charts with the built-in vertical GPU slots. We'll start off with just some Fractal cases, then show the competition. With our standard torture workload, baseline CPU temperature averaged 49 degrees above ambient, Celsius that is. Taking the front panel off, by which we mean the hinged door, not the entire frame, didn't significantly improve this temperature. Like the smaller Meshify 2, the XL stock fans don't move enough air to show much of a delta between having the filter in or out. The optimistic way to look at this is that Fractal's front panel design doesn't specifically affect airflow with the case and stock configuration, but we'll discuss that more in the standardized fans section coming up. Mounting the GPU vertically increased the CPU temperature, as it often does with our case benchmarking hardware. Even though the GPU cooler for ours exhausts mostly horizontally, turning the cooler sideways and placing it directly next to the CPU heatsink puts more hot air in the path of the CPU's tower cooler. As for the other Fractal parts, the non-XL ran about the same for CPU temperature. The S2 Meshify was a little warmer, but similar, and it's not until we start removing front panels that temperatures improve significantly. Onto the comparative numbers. The XL was slightly cooler than the smaller variant's 50-degree average in this test, putting it in the same performance range as the Be Quiet PureBase 500DX and the Phanteks P508 Digital. Both of these are cases that we reviewed positively, so it's in good company. The high placement of the stock fans keeps the CPU performance on par with the smaller non-XL case, since the fans are in almost the exact same position in relation to the CPU cooler. Moving into GPU testing, baseline GPU temperature was 55 degrees above ambient. Removing the front panel did help somewhat here, lowering the average to 53 degrees, but still not the dramatic decrease we see from solid-fronted cases. Moving the GPU vertically actually had more of an effect, dropping the average down to 49 degrees. The kit allowed us to keep the bottom of the 2-slot GPU approximately 9 centimeters away from the glass side panel, as opposed to a maximum of approximately 2 centimeters when using the built-in vertical slots. Users shouldn't be buying this vertical mounting kit with the expectation that it will increase cooling performance specifically, but by spacing the GPU far enough away from the side panel, it's reasonable to expect that performance will be at least as good as the horizontal mount, if not a little better. The type of GPU and CPU cooler used will heavily affect performance when switching the mounting orientation, so keep that in mind. Comparatively, the GPU average is worse than the base model Meshify 2s by 3 degrees, at 55 versus 52 degrees average. The 2XL is much taller than the 2, but both cases have their front fans mounted as high as possible, so most of the cool air being pushed through the XL goes above the GPU backplate and doesn't contribute significantly to cooling. This is worth keeping in mind, but users also shouldn't be buying the XL version of the case if they don't intend to fill it up or use it somehow. That extra space really should be used, whether that's a larger motherboard and water cooling or just a lot of hard drives. So either way, it would entail adding potentially radiators or at least fans, or otherwise altering the stock configuration. Average GPU temperature during Firestrike extreme stress testing was 55 degrees Celsius above ambient, not any different from baseline GPU torture. That's again several degrees warmer than the smaller XL, and for the same reasons. This is a large case, and the front fan mounts are far away from the motherboard. Getting good cool air coverage will require adjusting fan placement to the components installed at the very least. The first of our 2 blender tests used the CPU exclusively. It averaged 37 degrees Celsius above ambient, warmer than the Meshify 2's 36 degree average, but tied with the S2 Meshify. This is a less demanding stress test than the Torture or Firestrike benchmarks, so the resulting numbers are closer together, and a single degree difference is more significant. 37 degrees is in line with other mesh-fronted cases, like the Phanteks P400A RGB and the Corsair 4000D Airflow, but it's warmer than exceptional performers like the Lancool 2 Mesh. The second test uses the GPU for rendering. The GPU averaged 25 degrees above ambient here, worse than the Meshify 2's 24 degree average. Again, the XL requires more careful arrangement of the intake fans than the smaller variant, since there's more area to cover. Other than size, nothing has changed between the 2 cases that would significantly affect cooling performance. Our standardized fan section is longer than usual this time around because we ran extra tests with and without the filter installed. Our theory was that we'd see a greater delta with higher powered fans installed, which would potentially conflict with the filter more than the slower moving stock fans and have more to lose as a result. The baseline standardized results for the CPU is 47 degrees above ambient, which lowered to 44 degrees without the filter installed, potentially confirming our theory. 47 degrees is the temperature which we can compare to our other standardized fan tests, tying the XL exactly with the smaller Meshify 2, as well as the Meshify C with the same set of fans. The Phanteks Enthoo Pro 2 might be more of a fair comparison for these tests in particular because of the size. It's also another instance where we attempted to cool an unusually large case with the set of 3 standardized fans. It averaged 49 degrees in this test, a bit warmer than the XL. GPU temperature went from 52 degrees with the filter down to 51 degrees without it, not a huge leap. Together with the moderate improvement in CPU temperature and the results from the torture test discussed earlier, our conclusion is that the front filter in the Meshify 2 and Meshify 2 XL isn't overly restrictive, so that's good. We don't really like filters behind mesh in general because it's often unnecessary and overkill, but in this case it's relatively harmless. The XL performs worse than the normal-sized Meshify 2 here, but the difference in performance is because we continued to use the stock fan position for the standardized fans. 52 degrees is tied with the Nova Mesh TG, right behind Fractal's own Define 7, which in turn is practically the same case as the Meshify 2, but with worse ventilation. The Enthoo Pro 2 averaged 45 degrees here, significantly cooler than the XL, partly due to the Pro 2's lack of a traditional PSU shroud. We measured the noise level of the XL to be 38.7 dBA, down from the non-XL's 39.7 dBA. The difference is small, and just as likely caused by variance between fans as by the difference in case design. The front panels and fan arrangement are the same, and the cases are roughly the same depth, so the fans are all at approximately the same distance from the decibel meter in both cases. Bringing the case down to the desired 36 dBA noise threshold only required reducing the speed of the case fans in BIOS to 80% for reported speeds ranging from approximately 780 RPM to 850 RPM. The CPU averaged 53 degrees Celsius above ambient here, warmer than the Meshify 2's 51 degree average, but still respectably high in the chart thanks to the mesh front and the large intake fans. We've said it before, but it bears repeating. Even though they don't seal in or damp noise, mesh-fronted cases still do well in noise-normalized tests because their fans can simply slow down. As for the GPU, that averaged 54 degrees here, warmer than the Meshify 2's 52 degree average, just as it had been for every other GPU test so far, but still tied with the 500DX and only a little warmer than the 4000D airflow. It would be difficult to set up a carefully managed front-to-back airflow pattern in a case this large, but this is a case that encourages liquid cooling anyway. So the Meshify 2 XL is an XL Meshify 2, or in other words, it's a larger one. It's a Meshify Define 7 XL, basically. And there's not really much reason at this point, from our perspective, to buy Define 7 XL when you can buy this instead. There are a couple in there, but overall, the Meshify 2 XL, we think, is probably Fractal's best large case that it's selling right now. There is a focus on hard drives and accessibility for hard drives, adding a lot of hard drives. That's the key point with this one. If you are a user who still makes use of a lot of drives, or you want to house sort of a local NAS, more or less, in the host system, then this would be a good consideration for you, but it's large. The CS was 381 or 380 from Silverstone would be a good consideration as well. That's what we use for our server box. But although it can fit a good amount of drives at about 10, this can fit more, and the 381 is limited in its other features, like the amount of GPUs you can fit. So there's pros and cons to each. Versus the Meshify 2 non-XL, you should buy between the two of them, if you're only buying a Fractal case and it's one of these two, it should be the non-XL, unless parts won't fit. So if you're going for water cooling, lots of hard drives, those are reasons to go for this one potentially. But the Meshify 2 non-XL is still it's a bit larger than the average mid-tower. It's got a lot of space in there. And as long as the parts fit, it's probably better to go with that one, unless you're explicitly trying to allow for larger radiators, more liquid cooling, or more hard drives. Now, that said, some of these things are mutually exclusive, so keep that in mind. If you're gonna put 18 hard drives in this thing, then you will have less radiator support. So if you want both water cooling and a lot of hard drives, that might be a two-box solution or a different case entirely. One thing we think is cool about this case is that it can be adapted for SSI-EEB motherboard support, or larger than ATX motherboard support, and SSI-CEB, and 359 millimeter GPUs, and still support the storage arrangement of the case. So that's pretty interesting. You will be pushing past a wall of hard drives. Make sure you've got some extra fans in there. Bottom fan mounts maybe could be useful in that configuration, but it is mostly blocked off just looking at it. So they won't do a ton, but it'd move the air at least, and that may be helpful if it's pooling around the GPUs. For competing cases that you should consider, or reviews of ours you should look up if you're considering this one, it's $180 in theory. It's not in stock in many places when we checked, but 180 is what it should be. We saw it in stock for 220 in some places. That price likely won't last. But at 180, your main considerations would be the Lian Li O11 Dynamic XL, I think is the full name, So that's worth looking at for sure. We have a review of that one. You should also look at the Phanteks Enthoo Pro 2, perhaps the Phanteks P500A, and maybe the Define 7 XL, but we do think this one mostly supersedes that one. So those would be the competing products primarily to look at. We have reviews for those. Of course, there are a million cases out there. There's plenty more we haven't covered here today, but you can look through the charts too and see if there's anything that piques your interest, although some of them are off the market by now. So that's it for this one. Thanks for watching. As always, you can subscribe for more. Go to store.gamersnexus.net. If you want to grab this shirt, this is the Disappointment PC 2020 shirt. We're only going to do one more run of these, and they will be done after that, other than a version without the Disappointment tour dates on the back, because, well, 2020 is over and everyone wants it to be over. But if you want to commemorate it, or the PC build that we did in a previous video, then check it out on store.gamersnexus.net, or you can go to patreon.com/gamersnexus for behind the scenes videos. We've just posted a recent one. Thanks for watching. We'll see you all next time.